it's quite strange for me doing a TED Talk because I've spent more time in my life playing music than I have speaking, which is a weird thing to say at a TED Talk. But I guess my first experience in music was when I was, I think, about 4 years old or 5 years old, and I remember seeing this piano at a friend's house and actually going and bang on the keys and being really excited by all the sounds and thinking this is amazing because it felt like an additional voice, and that was what was very beautiful and very powerful for me. I grew up in a household where my mum was she was a Bharatanatyam dancer, and so she played a lot of Indian classical music in the house. My dad listened to a lot of flamenco and a lot of Cuban music, and you know, he had a quite an eclectic taste. My brothers listened to, I guess, everything from Led Zeppelin to The Doors and Herbie Hancock and then Miles Davis. And I remember the first album I bought was Miles Davis's A Kind of Blue when I was 8, which was a strange thing to buy. But it was kind of because I'd heard it in my dad's car on the radio. And I was just really into Bill Evans' piano playing. And so I got into improvisation, listening to a lot of flamenco and Indian classical music and all these oral traditions, jazz as well. And so I kind of ended up, I remember when I was about 11 years old, playing in the school practice rooms, and I was playing through a rag. I was classically trained as well. I kind of grew up also playing classical piano, but I really loved improvising or trying to play around with melodies, and particularly from Indian classical music. So I was doing that, and then a music teacher came in and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm playing through an Indian classical idea." And he said, "Well, where's your sheet music?" And I said, "You don't have it for Indian classical music. It's an oral tradition." He said, "Get out." So he banned me from the school music rooms for 6 years, which is nice. So then after that, I kind of ended up in a situation where when I was walking home from school, every time I'd be walking home from school, there'd be these National Front guys in a van following me with a loud hailer shouting racist abuse. And that drove me to my bedroom to just sit there and play music on my own and kind of try to find my own perception of who I was and change the perception of who I was from this sense of an inferiority complex. And through doing that, I kind of discovered a different way of thinking, which was very much about finding my identity through patterns. And I think this was a really interesting and formative time for me, because sitting in that room meant that I could find all kinds of ideas. I mean, I'd be playing jazz piano, and when I'd be playing jazz piano, I noticed this relationship with diatonic chord progressions and modes, and then I'd be playing jazz guitar or rock guitar, and again, I could see these patterns emerging, and it was all about shapes. And I kind of connected that up with a lot of other things, with films. I was watching a lot of films and thinking, I mean, I love watching the spaghetti westerns and people like Ennio Morricone and Bernard Herrmann, all these great people who really kind of played around with music against visuals. But, you know, I was always looking for patterns in everything. And then that brought me into something that really interested me was Indian mathematics, which was something called Vedic mathematics, which my mum told me about. And you have 16 sutras in Indian mathematics. And Indian classical music and rhythm works within these patterns. So, for example, you can have a 10-beat cycle that works like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so it goes on like that. But within those patterns, you have something called tihais, where you repeat a pattern 3 times and it lands on the first beat of the cycle. So within that 10-beat cycle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I can actually say something like da, which is actually from tabla patterns. If I repeat that 3 times, I land on the 1 of the 10-beat cycle. So I'm here on the 1. And you can actually have diminishing patterns like this as well, like, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 1, 2, 3, the 1, 2, the 1, the da. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 1, 2, 3, the 1, 2, the 1, the da. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, tak the deck the 1, 2, 3, 4, tak the deck the 1, 2, 3, tak the deck the 1, 2, tak the deck the 1, tak the deck the da, number the 1. So it's kind of this idea of actually creating these patterns that actually work very beautifully across different forms. And this is what I loved about Indian classical music, but also how it connected up with dance. I mean, these patterns actually come from an Indian classical form of dance called Kathak dance. And this is what stayed with me, this interest in dance generally. And it led me later on to work with a guy called Akram Khan, who's an Indian classical dancer, and that was his first love. But what I realized is that dance actually comes from something else. There's this idea in a treatise that was written 200 BC, which is called the Natya Shastra. This idea that actually all of the different forms work together. So you have theatre and music and dance all working together, having a common vocabulary, a common way of thinking. So all of the things that I was talking about, they belong to each of the forms. And so you had to know each of these forms as well. And I really like this idea. This really interested me, how you could collaborate with lots of different people. And at the time, when I was a teenager, I was still playing with a lot of different things. I mean, I would join youth orchestras, I was in a jazz quartet, I played in punk bands, rock bands, funk bands, the whole lot. So I was constantly kind of working with lots of different ways of thinking about music. And I love film scores as well. I just, as I was saying before, and I love the way in which music works with visuals. And later on that stayed with me, and I got into working with composing music for film and television and theatre and dance and video games and all kinds of things. And that kind of spirit of wanting to collaborate, which actually came originally from the Natya Shastra for me, of finding common vocabularies between different forms, that works really well with my perception of possibilities and potential of music. But also, it was kind of very much about the idea that, there was this concept, I suppose, of trying to find a narrative structure. There's an idea in Indian mythology that Lord Shiva is this dancer who's actually the creator and destroyer of the universe. The idea is that when Shiva begins his dance, the universe is created. When he ends his dance, then the universe is over. And this idea, for me, was actually something that I was always trying to tap into, this idea of a kind of narrative, something where you kind of find the flow of everything. You find the flow of the universe, and that dance that goes through everything is actually what you're trying to tap into. And that actually you become a medium for that, I suppose, for that kind of feeling to manifest itself. It's how you connect up with everything. It's not actually just about you as an individual anymore. And I think that's what I was always looking for whenever I've been even DJing, or whether I've been conducting an orchestra, or whether I've been, working on a video game. All of this is about trying to find my place within that flow of everything. And I guess that ultimately, for me, began to, I suppose, resonate with the idea of the point of music. So, there's another idea in Indian mythology that Om, which is the first sound that a baby's supposed to utter, is the breath of God. It's the divine sound, and it's a drone that runs through everything as well. And in 2001, I travelled around the world trying to find that feeling, I guess, that drone, that sound which actually permeates everything. And that took me to play one piece of music that I did ritualistically everywhere at 4:30 in the morning, which is a crazy thing to do. But I kind of went to the top of Mount Shasta in America and played in the snow blizzard and played this one piece of music at 4:30 in the morning. I went to the top of a mountain in Pilanesberg National Park and played with all these wild animals around, and again, listening to the sound of the drone. But the most compelling moment was when I played in Arnhem Land with a guy called Mundawai Yunupingu, who was an Aboriginal Australian who was in this sacred land that I went to. And I remember he took me to the sacred land almost as soon as I met him. And we started, I kind of sat down with him and he pulled out a guitar, which is a strange thing for an Aboriginal guy to do in the middle of the forest. But it was weird because I had mine with me as well. And we kind of had this jam. And he told me about the sacred land, which was where they'd created the first thing they called the yidaki, which is actually the didgeridoo. And this was the sound of the earth. This was the drone sound. And it was an amazing revelation for me, and it was a real epiphany moment when he told me this and when he was talking to me about this, because I suddenly got the idea of, for me, what the point of music was. And it's actually about, I guess it was the thing that I've always been looking for from that first moment when I was banging on those piano keys, which is this idea that there's a voice that is your identity, that no one else can play with, that, whoever they are, they can't take that away from you. They can't change your identity because your voice is what connects up with yourself and with everything around you. And that's the universal sound. And I created this piece which is based on that universal sound, and this is called Prophecy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.